Sometimes things happen that we can't quite put our finger on. We don't really know why they happened or how they happened. It's sort of outside of the realm of, our understanding. And, it's hard for us to compartmentalize what transpired, but, we always find a way. And, if you try hard enough, there's an old saying that goes, if you can't explain something, don't try, because you're gonna end up hurting yourself thinking too hard about that one. And you don't want to do that, because that's gonna mess you up in the long run. So if you could just reach into your pocket for me and oh, what's that in your hand? What you got there in your hand? You just pull out your pocket. What's that? Oh, that's 2 tickets. 2 tickets to the Bonkers Theater. Hubert Hunt was a struggling painter from Glenburg, Missouri. He never came from wealth. He was orphaned as a child when his parents were killed in a freak cooking accident on a celebrity chef-hosted television program. Now at the age of 34, he lived by simple means, collecting old cans on the side of the road to trade to junkyards for nickels, which he would in turn use to buy canned soup that he would turn the cans in from to make a head start towards his next purchase. His favorite soups were the really gross chunky ones that didn't actually taste like soup. Hubert kept all of his earthly possessions in a shopping cart that he wheeled around. He had paintings stacked high in his cart and had it covered with a blue tarp. He also carried around a book from the 1600s that explained how to make paint using natural resources. He would often forage for the natural resources and make all the paints himself. Many weeks would be spent out in the woods, giving him the time to make his paints. He would usually be assisted by little critters that lived in the woods, mainly squirrels, rabbits, and beavers. Hubert loved these curious creatures, as they would bring him various plants and fungi that he would proceed to grind into wonderful colors. One day in those woods, Hubert stumbled upon a small clearing, and within that small clearing he found a small cabin. Hubert was scared of that small cabin because it had a frightening aura to it. Thankfully, Hubert had a small squirrel with him at the time, and sent the squirrel in to investigate and report back to him with its findings. The squirrel darted off towards the house and squeezed its way under the front door. Hubert sat there waiting for well over an hour for the squirrel's return, but unfortunately didn't hear back from the little fella. He began to worry that something terrible had happened to the little guy. He picked up a nearby stick and began to sketch his little friend into the dirt. When he finished, Hubert decided it was time to investigate the cabin himself. Hubert approached the cabin and decided it was probably best to just knock on the front door with a forward approach. He thought that he could just pretend he was lost and in need of directions, but he didn't know how he could get his friend back, or even if his friend had been turned into stew. Hubert knocked on the door nervously and took a step back off the porch and lowered his hat to his chest. He heard footsteps from inside moving towards the door. They were quite light, and he probably wouldn't have been able to hear them if not being paired with the creaking of the wooden floor inside. He heard the footsteps stop as they reached the door, and the door slowly began to creak open. Hubert was shocked. Standing at the door was a beautiful woman. probably the most beautiful woman Hubert had ever seen in his life. Probably more beautiful than most people who ever lived had ever seen in their lives. Hubert became flustered and noticed that the woman was holding his little squirrel friend in her arms. The little squirrel was sleeping and had a wide smile on his little face. Hubert explained to the woman that the squirrel was his friend, and she happily invited him into the cabin. She began to prepare for him a big stew in a boiling cauldron that she stirred with a big wooden staff. She sat Hubert and the squirrel down at her table and tied bibs around their necks. With a wave of her hand, the cupboards flew open, and a couple of bowls, along with spoons, danced across the table until they settled down in front of Hubert and the squirrel. The woman must be a witch, Hubert had thought to himself. But she wasn't like any of the witches that he had seen before. Most had green or orange pigmentation, and some sort of issue with one or more of their eyes. But this woman's skin was a normal pigmentation, and her eyes looked perfectly healthy. Hubert thought that maybe she was a good witch, but this assumption was wrong, because witchcraft is objectively wrong, and the Bible makes that very clear. The witch levitated a ladle into her hand and scooped up some soup out of the big cauldron. She poured it in front of the man and the squirrel and instructed them to eat up. Normally, a witch would cackle after doing so, but she was far too well-mannered to do such a thing. Hubert and the squirrel both jumped out of their seats in protest and tore off their bibs. "We're not eating your witch soup," they shouted in unison. The witch was angry with the two and put two unique, terrible curses on both of them. The squirrel was cursed with no longer being able to pick up an acorn ever again, no matter the weight. And the painter was cursed with a far graver curse, unbeknownst to him. Some time had passed since the witch incident, and Hubert and the squirrel had become great friends after going through such a traumatic event together. Hubert kept lots of acorns in his shirt pocket that he allowed the squirrel to eat out of his hand, since the squirrel was unable to lift them on his own. Hubert had just finished mixing his paint and was ready to capture a beautiful portrait of a tree in front of him. Hubert stuck out his thumb to measure the distances and angles and began his painting. But something strange had happened. The second he had touched the brush to the canvas, the tree had vanished. Hubert jumped to his feet in awe. He ran out to where the tree was and waved his hands around, desperately trying to find where the tree could have gone. "Look at this, Hubert," the squirrel called out to his friend. Hubert turned in shock. In his small hands, the small squirrel was holding a painted portrait of the tree. Hubert dashed over and snatched the painting with the squirrel friend still attached. He ran his fingers across the canvas. The paint was dry and layered in the most magnificent way he had ever seen. Never before had Hubert seen painting of this caliber. "How could this have happened?" Hubert pondered aloud. "I'm not sure," replied the squirrel friend. "Maybe you should try painting something else." Hubert nodded and looked all around his surroundings for something else to paint. "I don't know what to paint, though," Hubert admitted. "That's easy," said the squirrel, positioning himself atop a rock. "Paint me." Hubert was conflicted. "Paint you?" he asked. "Yes," replied the squirrel. "I've always wanted a beautiful portrait that I could hang over my fireplace," he jested. Hubert nodded and readied another canvas and reapplied paint to his brush. Hubert held out his thumb to measure his little friend, who gave him 2 thumbs up and a reassuring nod in return. Hubert touched the brush against the canvas, only for his friend and the rock he sat atop to vanish in the same manner in which the tree did. Hubert dropped the canvas and fell to his knees. His eyes shifted downward to the now vibrant canvas containing his friend smiling back at him. Hubert finally worked up the nerve to run his hands across the canvas to feel the dry paint. Hubert was once able to capture momentary beauty in an ever-changing world, but as he gazed deep into the canvas, which any passerby would praise as a fantastic, lively work of art, Hubert felt no sense of life in the painting. All he could see was beauty that had been stolen out of the world, that now only resides on a static canvas that will one day wither and fade. Hubert was left with nothing to lose. His last bastion of solace was taken from him. He left his painting supplies and paintings in his shopping cart and made his way to the railroad track. There he lied waiting for the next train to pass, so he could take it to wherever it may lead. It wasn't long until another hobo wandered across Hubert's abandoned shopping cart and rummaged through it, looking for something to eat or shoot up. But all the poor hobo found was a handful of acorns and the leftover painting supplies. He pulled out the painted canvases and was amazed by the intricate detail of them. Naturally, he made his way to a nearby town and sold the paintings for $5 each to a passing man dressed head to toe in black. The man in black then proceeded to sell the paintings $40 apiece to a nearby pawn shop. The paintings were then sold at separate times from the pawn shop. The tree painting sold to an elderly couple for $80, who kept it in their house, which became the painting's final resting place, as the house burnt down when it was inherited by the elderly couple's crackhead son, who left the stove on when he was high off his rocker. The squirrel painting, however, sold to an art collector, who made off with it for $200, and later flipped it for $10,000 at a local art show. Then it showed up at another art show in a small city where it sold for $30,000. Then at a slightly smaller city where it only sold for $12,000. But it was fine because it sold for $740,000 at a really big art show only a month later. After a few months, the painting was world famous, and also gained a lot of publicity because nobody was sure who originally had painted the thing. When the painting would be displayed at auctions, people would scratch their chins and heads for hours, wondering who could have painted it. Because of this intrigue, the painting was a guaranteed moneymaker. No matter how much you would spend on the painting, it was guaranteed that someone would buy it off of you. The painting sold for millions to billions to trillions. Thankfully, the museums were able to take notice, and they all banded together to buy the painting to get it off the market in a contractual agreement that asserted that all the museums who joined in on the venture of buying the painting would rotate the painting through their museums on a monthly basis. The transportation for the painting was very expensive because of the high demand for it, but the museums could easily afford it because of the massive crowds that would come to see the painting. The crowds were so large that the museums had to charge exorbitant premiums to see the exhibit in which it was housed. All of this was happening for months and years, completely unbeknownst to Hubert. Hubert, who had now found himself wandering the streets of Paris after all these years. Hubert had one last thing to accomplish in his life, one final painting, his magnum opus, a celebrity portrait. But not of any celebrity, this was a special celebrity, a celebrity chef. The one who had hosted the television cooking competition that claimed his parents' lives. You see, Hubert had traced back the root of all of his problems to this one person. He had figured that if it weren't for this chef, his parents would not have gone on that cooking show. And if they hadn't done that, they would be alive. And if they were alive, he wouldn't have been orphaned. And if he hadn't been orphaned, he wouldn't have been poor. And if he wouldn't have been poor, he wouldn't have become a hobo. And if he wouldn't have become a hobo, he wouldn't have taken up painting. And if he wouldn't have taken up painting, he wouldn't have foraged for natural resources for paint. And if he wouldn't have foraged for natural resources for paint, he wouldn't have found that cabin. And if he wouldn't have found that cabin, he wouldn't have run into that witch. And if he wouldn't have run into that witch, he wouldn't have been cursed. And if he wouldn't have been cursed, he wouldn't have turned his friend into a painting. So as you can see, his train of thought led him to only one destination. And that destination was inside an office building across the street from a luxury hotel in which that world-famous celebrity chef happened to be staying. Hubert waited for quite some time with binoculars propped up on a tripod and fixed on the hotel room in which the chef resided. He had an easel fixed beside him with canvas ready and paintbrush in hand. He had his arm stretched out, with thumb upright, to measure the angles and scale of the building and of the celebrity chef when he appeared. The curtains were closed over the window, but Hubert knew it was only a matter of time before the chef would want to see the beautiful view of the bustling Paris streets down below. A few hours passed and Hubert finally saw something, a silhouette that was growing larger on the curtains. This was him. This was the celebrity chef coming to open the curtains. Hubert had waited his whole life for this moment, whether he knew it or not. The curtains slid open, and sure as anything, the man standing in the window was the celebrity chef. Without hesitation, Hubert pressed his brush against the canvas. In an instant, the celebrity chef was gone. Hubert turned to the canvas to see the celebrity chef staring back at him, forever captured on canvas.